They hear the truth, but they don't listen. They read the truth, but they don't learn. They see the storm coming, but they walk straight into it with smiles on their faces and blood on their hands. And every man who sat in that Oval Office knew exactly what time it was. But none of them cared to change the clock, because the truth don't fit in their speeches. The truth don't dance well with capitalism. The truth don't sit comfortably next to military budgets and oil deals. The truth is loud, and they like silence. The truth is sharp, and they prefer dull words to keep dull minds obedient. So every time a voice rose up and said, "This house is on fire," they looked away, poured gasoline, and blamed the ones coughing in the smoke. They didn't ignore the warnings because they didn't hear them. They ignored them because they understood them. They knew what was being said. They knew the consequences. They knew that if they ever took those warnings seriously, they'd have to put down their weapons, loosen their grip, and let the people breathe free. But the presidency was never about people. It was never about justice. It was always about power. You think they didn't know about the ghettos? You think they didn't see the police beating our brothers in the street? You think they didn't know how redlining worked, how segregation wasn't just a law, it was an economy? They knew. They funded it. They protected it. And every 4 years they paraded a new smile, a new suit, a new promise, and kept the same chains. Some of y'all still believe they didn't hear the warnings. Some of y'all think they were just too busy, too distracted, too overwhelmed. No, they were too comfortable. See, the truth rattles their bones because it exposes them. Because once you admit the system is broken, you've got no excuse not to fix it. And if you've got no excuse not to fix it, but you keep it broken, that means you want it broken. They heard every word about injustice. They saw the cries for peace. They saw the calls for dignity, for respect, for real freedom, not just on paper, but in practice. But those calls came with a price. They would have had to dismantle their privilege. They would have had to hold their friends accountable. They would have had to choose humanity over profit, and that was never a choice they were willing to make. So they smiled while cities burned. They smiled while mothers wept. They smiled while children drank poison water and ate from empty plates. And they held up flags and prayed on microphones, but they never moved their hands toward justice. Because justice don't fill their campaign accounts. Justice don't protect their golf courses. Justice don't salute their power. And let me tell you this, they weren't just ignoring a man. They were ignoring a movement, a generation, a prophecy, a reckoning. And every time they looked the other way, they weren't just denying a warning, they were choosing the consequences. They chose war. They chose mass incarceration. They chose surveillance. They chose greed. And when you choose those things, you choose to stand on the wrong side of history. They say ignorance is bliss, but in the halls of power, ignorance is a performance. Every president, from the first to the most recent, had access to more intelligence, more knowledge, and more briefings than any citizen could imagine. They have people whispering in their ears day and night, people whose only job is to watch, to listen, to study the pulse of the people and the mood of the streets. They are surrounded by advisors, scholars, analysts, and historians who bring them the truth dressed in facts, charts, and lived realities. So when someone rose up and called out the injustice, when someone demanded change, they didn't turn away because they didn't understand. They turned away because they did. These leaders weren't confused. They weren't oblivious. They weren't lost in the fog of bureaucracy. No, they were sharply aware. They read the reports about economic disparity. They saw the statistics about police brutality. They knew what redlining did to communities of color. They had the numbers, the evidence, the protests, and the testimonies. Every time a voice rose up to speak truth to power, it rang like thunder through the system. But instead of lightning striking change, the silence of indifference followed. That silence wasn't an accident. It was a decision. They sat in comfortable chairs and watched as truth poured into the streets. They watched marches, they heard the chants, and they felt the heat. But comfort makes cowards out of men. They didn't want to give up anything. They didn't want to lose votes. They didn't want to upset their donors. They didn't want to look weak in front of the corporations that paid for their campaigns. So they covered their ears with policy papers and filled their mouths with hollow words. They chose to pacify the public rather than liberate them. Power is not simply held, it is protected. It is shielded by systems that reward obedience and punish resistance. When a warning challenges the very core of that power, it is not welcomed, it is neutralized. That is why every president ignored the cries, not because those cries were false or radical, but because they were true, and that truth demanded action they were unwilling to take. They would rather maintain the illusion of democracy than risk the reality of justice. Because justice is inconvenient. It disrupts the status quo. It calls for the redistribution of resources, the rethinking of priorities, and the questioning of the entire foundation. And those in power don't want a new foundation. They want to keep standing on the old one, no matter how many it buries. You can't tell me that the most powerful office in the world, with access to intelligence agencies, economic advisors, and the full machinery of the state, simply didn't understand what was happening to black people, to poor people, to the working class. You can't convince me that when entire communities were poisoned, imprisoned, underfunded, and over-policed, that those in charge didn't know. They knew. They read every report, they saw every protest, and they met with every advisor who dared tell the truth. And every time they chose to turn their backs. They chose to prioritize the illusion of order over the pursuit of justice. They chose to frame protest as violence, resistance as terrorism, and demands for equality as threats to national security. They weaponized language, distorted narratives, and hid behind patriotism. Not because they misunderstood the warnings, but because they understood them too well. Because to take those warnings seriously would mean shaking the pillars of power. It would mean going to war not with the people, but with the very institutions that keep the elite comfortable. And they weren't ready for that war. What they feared most wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Because clarity would force a reckoning. Clarity would shine a light on their complicity. Clarity would reveal that the system doesn't fail. It functions exactly as intended. And when someone holds up a mirror and says, "Look at what you've built," it terrifies those who profit from the reflection. So they ignore the mirror, they ignore the message, they ignore the messenger. Not because it is irrelevant, but because it is undeniable. When presidents stand on podiums and talk about freedom, they do so while watching children in cages. When they speak of liberty, they do it while drones fly over foreign lands. When they praise the Constitution, they do it while black bodies fill prison cells at rates that scream genocide. This is not ignorance. This is design. This is strategy. This is self-preservation. The truth is, they ignored the warnings because they knew following them would mean cutting off the very hand that feeds their power. They would have to turn against the banks, the corporations, the defense contractors, the lobbyists, and the political donors that keep them afloat. And they were never ready to do that. To accept the warnings would require moral courage, and the presidency has not been a seat of moral courage. It has been a stage for moral compromise. Every warning that came their way was an invitation to change course, to challenge the machine, to dismantle systemic racism, to uplift the oppressed, to move from empty rhetoric to radical reform. And every time, they declined the invitation, not because they couldn't RSVP, but because they feared what would happen if they showed up. Ignoring truth is not passive, it's aggressive. It's an act of violence dressed in silence. It's a decision to maintain the suffering of others so a few can sleep peacefully at night. The truth didn't fail to reach them. It reached them loud and clear. But in the battle between truth and power, they chose power. And that is why every president, regardless of party, regardless of promises, regardless of speeches, turned their back when the moment of reckoning arrived. Because reckoning requires sacrifice, and they were never willing to give up what they had to gain what was right. Every president who walked into office walked into a country already bleeding. They inherited injustice like an old family heirloom, dusty, broken, but too valuable to throw away. They saw the scars carved into the land, into the people, into the very foundation of this so-called democracy. And still they chose to smile and wave, to stand in front of flags and call this place great. But greatness built on graves is not greatness, it is deception. And every administration saw the rot beneath the surface. They saw the housing projects stacked like cages. They saw the schools crumbling while banks were bailed out. They saw the neighborhoods overrun by poverty and patrol cars, and still they chose the easy path. Not the path of justice, not the path of truth, but the path of convenience. Because convenience doesn't cost votes. Convenience doesn't challenge donors. Convenience doesn't scare Wall Street. These presidents weren't blind. They weren't stumbling around in the dark. They had maps. They had compasses. They had the voices of the people shouting direction. But they pretended not to hear, because hearing would mean stopping. Hearing would mean changing course. And changing course means letting go of comfort. That was never on the agenda. They saw the prisons fill up with black and brown bodies, and they called it law and order. They saw immigrants locked in cages and called it border control. They saw water poisoned, land stolen, and voices silenced, and they called it progress. But progress for who? For the ones already sitting at the table. For the corporations writing policy behind closed doors. For the police departments stacking military weapons in their basements. That is not progress, it's preservation of power. Every time a voice rose up from the streets, crying out for justice, for equity, for dignity, it was met not with change, but with strategy. A strategy to pacify, to delay, to spin the narrative until truth looked like threat and oppression looked like peacekeeping. The presidents knew exactly how to play the game. They would meet with community leaders, pose for pictures, offer vague promises, and then return to their palaces of comfort where nothing ever really changed. They would give speeches about unity while signing budgets that deepened the divide. They would speak of hope while building more prisons. They would talk about opportunity while ignoring the red lines drawn around entire communities. This wasn't failure. This was success by their standards. Because their goal was never liberation, it was containment. Contain the anger, contain the uprising, contain the truth. They didn't just see injustice, they managed it. They invested in it. They profited from it. And they handed it down like tradition, each administration fine-tuning the machinery of inequality. And when confronted, they didn't apologize, they justified. They pointed to crime statistics without talking about poverty. They pointed to test scores without mentioning defunded schools. They pointed to violence without acknowledging the violence of eviction, of starvation, of hopelessness. They weaponized data, twisted logic, and hid behind policies dressed in neutrality. But policy is never neutral. It always serves someone. And in this country, it rarely serves the poor, the marginalized, the silenced. The presidency was never designed to serve the people. It was designed to manage the people. And managing means making sure the machine keeps running, no matter who it runs over. So when presidents saw the people rising, not with weapons, but with words, with demands, with dreams of something better, they got scared. Because real change doesn't come in polite packages. Real change means redistribution. Real change means dismantling. Real change means saying no to billionaires, no to private prisons, no to oil companies, no to imperialism. And no president wanted to say no to the hand that feeds their campaigns, their legacies, their power. It's not that they didn't believe in justice. It's that they believed more in stability, in keeping things quiet, in keeping things moving. But quiet does not equal peace, and motion does not equal progress. The presidents saw the suffering. They had the statistics, the photos, the reports. They knew what was happening. But to address it meant naming it. And to name it meant facing it. And to face it meant fighting it. But they didn't want that fight. Because that fight isn't winnable by speeches. That fight requires action. That fight requires risk. And power does not take risks. It takes precautions. It builds walls. It sends troops. It writes checks to police unions and writes off the poor. Every president had a chance to shift the tide. They had the authority, the platform, the audience. But they used that platform to protect the powerful. They used that authority to pacify dissent. They used that audience to sell false hope. Because hope sells better than truth. Hope keeps people waiting. Truth gets people moving. And movement is dangerous to those who benefit from stillness. So instead of moving with the people, they moved against them. Quietly with policy. Quietly with vetoes. Quietly with inaction. They saw the fire in the hearts of those who marched, those who fought, those who cried out in the wilderness. And they tried to smother it with compromise, with commissions, with carefully crafted language that meant nothing and changed less. They met the urgency of the moment with delay. They met the pain of the people with polished statements. They met rebellion with repression. Because in the eyes of power, stability is sacred. Not justice, not humanity, not truth, but stability. And stability in a broken system means continued suffering for those at the bottom. Every president made a choice, not once, but over and over, to fund war over welfare, to expand prisons instead of schools, to militarize police instead of investing in peace. These were not accidents. These were priorities. These were values in action. And values aren't spoken, they're lived. Every budget is a moral document. Every executive order, every veto, every silence speaks louder than any speech. They showed us what mattered to them every day they sat in office. And what mattered was never the people in the streets. It was never the children in underfunded schools. It was never the families facing eviction. What mattered was preserving the system that made their power possible. The most dangerous thing to those in power has never been the lie. It's always been the truth. Lies are easy. Lies are useful. Lies can be packaged, promoted, and sold to the public like a shiny product in a commercial. Lies can be woven into speeches, stitched into laws, and draped over the faces of politicians like clean masks hiding dirty intentions. But the truth is sharp. The truth cuts. The truth refuses to sit still. The truth is not polite, not convenient, and certainly not safe for those who've built their lives on oppression. That's why every time truth rises, power reaches for a weapon. Not because it doesn't understand the truth, but because it understands it too well. The truth doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait to be approved by the press or vetted by committees. It bursts through doors. It shows up on the front lines. It speaks through the mouths of the oppressed, the beaten, the silenced. It lives in the chants of protesters, in the last breath of the murdered, in the broken glass of looted storefronts, in the pain of mothers who bury sons. And when it shows itself, it demands something that power cannot give without risking its own survival: accountability. Because accountability threatens privilege, and privilege defends itself with everything it has. That's why truth is feared, not because it brings chaos, but because it brings clarity. Clarity reveals the game. Clarity shows who's profiting and who's dying. Clarity makes it impossible to pretend that oppression is accidental. Clarity exposes the design, the strategy, the long history of decisions dressed up as mistakes. And once people see clearly, they start asking questions power can't answer. Why are the poor always blamed for poverty? Why are prisons filled with those who never had a chance? Why are bombs dropped in countries that never attacked us? Why do billionaires pay less taxes than their janitors? Why does justice seem like a privilege and not a right? These are the questions that make power tremble, because these are the questions that lead to action. Power thrives in confusion. It thrives when people fight each other instead of the system. It thrives when the truth is buried under propaganda, under distractions, under 1,000 news cycles that spin lies so fast people get dizzy trying to hold on to anything real. So when truth shows up and speaks plainly, when it refuses to be softened or silenced, it becomes a threat. Not because it's violent, but because it breaks the spell, it wakes people up. And awaking people are a dangerous people. Because once people are awake, they start organizing, they start demanding, they start believing in their own power. And that is the one thing this system cannot afford. That's why every time someone speaks the truth too loudly, they're labeled a threat. They're called radical, extremist, un-American. Their names are dragged through the mud, their character assassinated, their motives questioned. Because if the people start listening, really listening, then the whole illusion falls apart. The illusion of freedom, of equality, of justice. Because truth unmasks it all. It shows that this country was built not on liberty, but on theft. Not on democracy, but on domination. Not on justice, but on exploitation. And that revelation is dangerous to those who sit atop the mountain built on bones. They say they fear division, but what they really fear is exposure. They say they fear unrest, but what they really fear is reckoning. Because once the lie is stripped away, the emperor stands naked. And when people see the emperor naked, they stop bowing. They stop obeying. They stop believing in the myths that keep them enslaved. And then the people start looking at each other instead of looking up. They start building together. They start reclaiming what was stolen. That is the real revolution, not just in protests or policy, but in perception, in seeing through the veil, in recognizing that the system doesn't need to be fixed, it needs to be replaced. That's why every institution is designed to suppress truth. Schools teach obedience, not liberation. Media sells fear, not understanding. Politics rewards compromise, not conviction. And when someone refuses to play by the rules, when someone tells the truth without apology, the entire machine moves against them. They're surveilled, discredited, threatened, because the truth does what no weapon can do. It unites. It connects the struggles of the oppressed. It shows that what happens in the prisons is tied to what happens in the projects. That what happens in the streets of Ferguson is connected to what happens in Gaza. That poverty is not random, and violence is not senseless, but both are engineered to keep the powerful in place. Truth is the greatest danger to those who benefit from lies, and that's why they fund misinformation. That's why they control the narrative. That's why they write history in their own image and erase the voices that dared to challenge them. Because truth remembers. Truth survives even when its speakers are silenced. It passes from generation to generation, waiting for the moment when it can rise again. And when it does, it doesn't come alone. It brings with it the fire of the people, the memory of the struggle, the strength of those who refuse to be broken. And that is what every president, every power broker, every empire fears, not the lie being exposed, but the truth being believed. They don't imprison the liars, they imprison the truth tellers. They don't assassinate the cowards, they assassinate the brave. They don't silence the ones who uphold the system. They silence the ones who threaten to dismantle it. Because in the eyes of power, the truth is not just inconvenient, it's revolutionary. It tears down monuments, it rewrites laws, it flips the tables in the temples of greed. And once the people start speaking it, there's no turning back. That's why they feared it then. That's why they fear it now. Because the truth, once set free, cannot be caged again. The greatest lie told by every administration is that they didn't know, that somehow the warning slipped past them, that the suffering was hidden, that the truth was too quiet. But the truth was never quiet, it was screaming. It echoed through the streets, rang through the jails, pulsed in the veins of the forgotten. The truth was in the smoke of the riots, in the chants of the marches, in the silence of mothers holding folded flags instead of living sons. Every warning was loud, clear, direct, and impossible to ignore unless ignorance was the goal. And that's what it was, a deliberate decision to look away, not a failure to hear, but a refusal to listen, not a lack of understanding, but a rejection of responsibility. Because to admit the truth was to admit guilt, and guilt requires atonement, and none of them were ready to pay that price. They chose silence not out of confusion, but out of calculation. They knew what the warnings meant. They understood exactly what was being demanded. They knew that to follow those calls would require them to unmake the very machine they were elected to maintain. It wasn't just one man or one movement they turned away from. It was an entire generation rising up to say enough. It was the sound of history knocking at their door. And every single time they locked it, because they knew that if they let that truth in, it would not be a guest. It would take over the House. It would walk into the Pentagon and say no more war. It would step into Congress and say no more blood money. It would stand in the prisons and say open the gates. It would stand in the boardrooms and say justice before profit. And they were never ready for that kind of visitor. They held meetings, commissioned reports, shook hands with community leaders, smiled for the cameras, and then did nothing. Or worse, they did the opposite. They increased police budgets. They widened surveillance. They expanded prisons. They passed laws with kind words and cruel consequences. They watched the storm approach and built bigger roofs for themselves, not shelters for the people. Because deep down they knew the storm was righteous. They knew it wasn't chaos, it was justice taking a new form. And they feared that justice more than they feared violence, because justice changes everything. Justice demands truth, demands memory, demands a reckoning. And they were raised in a country that teaches you how to run from history, not confront it. Every president was given a chance to listen. Every president was given a moment where the truth stood up and made itself impossible to ignore. And every one of them turned their back, because acknowledging the truth would have meant turning their back on the system that handed them power. It would have meant saying, this is broken, and I will break with it. But they weren't revolutionaries, they were managers. They weren't trying to shake the foundations. They were trying to protect the ceiling. And so they smiled as the foundations cracked, as communities sank, as bodies piled up under the weight of state-sanctioned neglect. They smiled knowing they were making a choice. Not a mistake, not an oversight. A choice, and when the warnings turned into demands, they responded with force. Tear gas for protesters, batons for the brave. Tanks in neighborhoods that needed teachers. Military-grade silence for voices that needed microphones. They treated truth like a threat because it was a threat to their image, to their narrative, to the mythology of a nation that calls itself free while chaining its future to its past. The truth was never vague. It was written on cardboard signs. It was shouted from megaphones. It was painted on the sides of buildings and stitched into banners held by trembling hands. It was broadcast across every street and screen. The problem was never the volume, it was the audience. They didn't just ignore the truth. They punished it. They criminalized the people who spoke it. They surveilled them, targeted them, silenced them. They called them radicals, anarchists, terrorists. They put their names on watch lists, their faces in databases, their families under threat, because the system knows how to protect itself. It knows that the greatest danger isn't the mob. It's the moment when the mob becomes a movement, when the crowd stops reacting and starts organizing, when the anger turns into strategy. That's what they fear, not just the fire, but the focus. So they built narratives to shield themselves. They called for peace without justice. They preached patience while people died waiting. They asked for calm while stomping on necks. They used the language of unity to demand silence. But there can be no unity without truth. And truth cannot be negotiated. It cannot be diluted into sound bites or buried in legislative process. It must be faced head on. But instead of facing it, they chose to bury it under bureaucracy. They smothered it in procedure. They tried to outlast it, hoping that the next crisis, the next distraction, the next election would make people forget. But the truth does not forget. The truth remembers. The truth haunts. They didn't just fail to act, they refused to act. And in that refusal, they revealed everything. They revealed that the presidency, for all its ceremony, for all its promises, is still just another gear in a machine that runs on the suffering of the poor, the exploited, the silenced. A machine that only pauses long enough to make people believe it's being repaired. But the warnings were never about repair. They were about revolution. They were about tearing down the machinery and rebuilding something human, something honest, something rooted in justice instead of profit, in dignity instead of dominance. And every president who heard those warnings and walked the other way was not just ignoring a message. They were confirming a truth that this system does not fear failure, it fears change, it fears awakening. It fears a people who finally see that power was never meant to serve them, only control them.